My name's Tiffany Easthom. I'm the Executive Director for Nonviolent Peaceforce. NP is a non-governmental organization that works to increase the safety and security for civilians who are affected by violent conflict through the implementation of unarmed civilian protection. Through the work of unarmed civilian protection, the practice is to work with civilians who are trained in the actions, strategies, methodologies of UCP to be able to de-link our dependency on armed actors for personal security, for community stabilization. We live in a world where we securitize most problems, we militarize most responses, and in reality, what we know is sending in guns, more guns to protect people from guns is literally the definition of insanity. All it does is escalate tensions and incidents of violence, and statistically across the board, we're failing civilians. What we're seeing is civilians are not only not being protected from the original violence that the armed actors were sent in to protect them, they're often victims of exploitation and abuse from military forces. A militarized response to violent conflict is inherently political, it's inherently resource-based, and it is the furthest away from actual concerns and care for safety and security for civilians. A civilian-led defense, a civilian-led protection force it's a holistic approach to stabilization for including the most people possible in the safest possible environment. Sure. So at NP, we deploy teams of internationals and locally hired national staff to work together, embedded in communities that are directly affected by violent conflict. We live and work in the communities that we serve, and we pair together people who are from outside of the country who will come in with particular professional and educational and technical expertise, as well as people who are hired from the local community who are fluent in obviously the language, the culture, and who most importantly will be the change agents, long-term change agents in the communities that they serve. As internationals, we come and go. The really most important place to focus our energies is on supporting our national colleagues, because they are ultimately the duty bearers of change as it relates to approaches to how we address violent conflict. We train our teams up in the actions and strategies of unarmed civilian protection. It's a set of methodologies that includes, I often describe our work as sort of having two main tracks. It's proactive and reactive. So the reactive side of our work is the direct protection piece. This is the sort of foundational work of unarmed civilian protection, where we do things like protective accompaniment, we do protective presence or in strategic locations, where by our presence as a physical manifestation of the international community's concern for an affected population, representing a nonpartisan group of people who do not have skin in the game on what the outcome of the actual conflict is. Our only concern is the safety and security for civilians who are being affected by the conflict around it, that we work to immediately work on deterring violence and saving lives in the moment. So that's the reactive. Tensions are high, threats are real, violence is imminent or already occurring, and we're leveraging our relationships with all parties to the conflict, with the stakeholders, civilian and otherwise, to be able to increase safety and security in the moment. The other side of our work is the proactive track, and this is really looking at the long game. So doing that reactive work is very labor intense, it's reactive, and what the reality is that means that danger is imminent. What we want to do is push out space around civilians who are affected by violent conflict, so that they are experiencing increasing and improving stability. Even if there is conflict that's happening around them, that there are oases of security and stability for civilians to be able to, at the very minimum, just live their normal lives. As we all know, in protracted conflict, things get everything from your healthcare, from your education, from your livelihood, everything becomes disrupted. So at the very basics, we want to be able to support communities to stay home, to not have to displace, and to be able to continue to take care of themselves and their families. The next level up for those who are interested is to contribute towards building the peace that they want in their communities. As foreigners, as an external actor, it is not our role to dictate how a conflict should be solved, nor what that outcome and that peace going forward should be like. That doesn't work. It has to come from the communities within. So we work to support building local peace infrastructure. We work with parts of society who are often not considered, really specifically, really heavy engagement working with women and their participation in building peace and security, youth and children, in addition to men, and helping men sort of re-envision their role away from military and security actors to civilian peace activists. Sure. So the scope of unarmed civilian protection work takes us along the full spectrum of conflict. So UCP work can be applicable and used in the pre-conflict stage if there's an escalation, security is deteriorating. That's the ideal place that we're working in because the focus is therefore on prevention. We can also apply it during sort of the hot moments when conflict is active and we're really looking at engaging in life-saving work. And then in that sort of very long, arduous, and dangerous path from hot conflict towards ultimately transition into stability and into the idealized version of what local peace will be. In terms of how do we measure the impact of our work and where does it go, it's a challenge. One of the most challenging things to be able to do is we are ideally trying to prove a negative. Because we were there, because of the work that we were doing, people did not die or they were not harmed. And as we know, conflict is they're very complex settings with a multiplicity of factors. And in reality, all of us are contributory to a larger outcome. So being able to completely isolate and identify can be a little bit challenging. That being said, we use a number of indicators. One of the most useful indicators for us is really looking at people's perceptions of their own personal security. And this can be actually really effective along that whole spectrum that I was describing, because we all, and this is true universally, doesn't matter where we live in the world, we make decisions about how we run our personal life based on how physically safe we feel. We choose about whether we'll go out at night, whether we will let our kids walk alone on the streets. And when you're in a conflict environment, do you send your kids to school? Do you go out into the farms, or do you only do subsistence farming? So the impact of your perceptions of your insecurity really change and adapt the way that you live your life. So we use that a lot. And this, in the moment when conflict is hot, we can have people say, that they felt that they would have been harmed or they would have been killed doing this activity had there not been a protective accompaniment team with them. And what's I find one of the most really interesting and moving areas is post-conflict or post-hot conflict is when you'll be talking to communities and they'll say, we're not farming over there because we're afraid because of a massacre. And when you unpeel the onion, you find out that the last massacre maybe happened 10 years ago, but they're still really adapting the way that they work based on that historical fear. So that's when we're really working on building that local peace infrastructure and that sense of local power in and around self-protection. There's quantitative ways that we can measure the work that we do, sort of number of people participating in mediation and dialogue at the local level, community members who are engaging with the armed actors, state or non-state armed actors, or with their civil authorities, trying to hold their own duty bearers accountable for the work that we do. We can measure sort of the more engagement we do in the community on those things, their level of participation increases. We're working right now on our women's peacekeeping teams to demonstrate the correlation between women's active participation in peace and security and their own personal improved security. As they become known more in their community for being a respected member of the community who is contributing to peace and stability, they are less likely to be personally harmed, even in instances of domestic violence or intercommunal violence. There's an inherent skepticism when we talk about sending unarmed civilians into areas of high conflict. We have teams in South Sudan, we have teams on the front lines in northern Iraq, in the Mosul response, and to be very clear, it is what I always want people to understand is we are not suggesting this is the singular response, the magic bullet that is going to fix all of our global problems as it relates to war. War and violent conflict is extraordinarily complex and there is no singular answer. But what we do know through the practical application every day of the work that we do is that with the right training and the right strategies and the right approach in the right contexts, the work of unarmed civilian protection does actually quantitatively increase the safety and security of civilians who are affected by violent conflict. People are experiencing the worst moments of their life, and what's happening around them is political and it's economic, and we pour the majority of our global resources into that level, into the high level engagement, into the state level, government level, and into immediate material aid support. But where we need to increase our global investment is at the root causes of the conflict, supporting those who are most affected by the conflicts that they're living in, and to be able to help build their strength, to be able to as a civilian population, self-protect without relying on armed actors to be able to do that. Well, I mean, we're living in a time right now where our perceptions of civilian security have been really challenged. We've got more people displaced than we have had in recorded history. We're doing something wrong. We collectively need to improve the way that we approach the protection of civilians. And sending in military has been the standard approach. We are proving that sending an unarmed civilian in many cases is actually more effective at being able to help people to be able to stay home. Sure. So when we're recruiting our teams to go into the field, we are usually looking for a good combination of skills and backgrounds. What generally happens is we'll end up with a number of people in a team who did not grow up in conflict, but they have an educational and professional background in something related to international relations, mediation, negotiation, social work, sort of something within the field of peace and justice studies. And they come to it with that background. We also like to have people in our teams who grew up in conflict-affected environments. And whether they're from some of them will be from the community that we're working in, but some of them may be from other countries where they didn't have the opportunity perhaps to go to university or college to study, but because they grew up in a conflict-affected environment, they have a lived experience and have developed their own community-based skill set that is related to sort of community-based peace and justice. And when we bring those groups together, we find that we've got an elevated quality of teamwork and response. Everybody, no matter what their background is, when they come to us, go through what's called a mission preparedness training. And this is an intensive residential program that can be anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on the size of the group. It's highly interactive, and they are working on what I like to call it unarmed civilian protection boot camp. So they start right with nonviolence. What is nonviolence? What are the principles of nonviolence? Where did our work come from? And then they are being trained in everything from being able to adapt their messaging to different stakeholders, how to do context analysis and conflict analysis, particularly within that local context. They are learning, as you mentioned, people like Michael Nagler in the Center for Meta Center for Nonviolence. A lot of the training that we do is really rooted in the practice from the United States civil rights movement, where they're being actually trained to be in the face of violence and not react. When you work and live in a protracted conflict area, the chance that somebody will be violent around you or will be aggressive around you, it's really important that our staff are being really trained and prepared to watch their own triggers and to be able to manage themselves. We do a lot of intensive team building work. We don't do things alone. Everybody works as part of a team. And so that's all sort of part of their training. So that's the core piece. And then they do very intensive safety and security training that's tailored to each of the country programs that we work in, depending on what the risks are, as well as thematic areas. So if they're working more associated with women's participation or children's protection or human rights defenders, that kind of stuff. So it all comes together sort of as a comprehensive training program. Sure. I mean, in terms of our work, we have just launched an online course that we developed in partnership with United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, that's now being offered online. And the second round of it will start just coming up in September, and it's course that runs over the course of 7 weeks. It's a very intensive, very practical course on the foundations of unarmed civilian protection work. It is offered either for university credit or for not, depending on what you're interested. So that's one way to get involved. We do have local chapters if you're in the U.S. We have in some of the states, we have local chapters where community groups have come together really in support of unarmed civilian protection. And not only are they working to support our international work, but they're also really working to do trainings in schools and in their own communities, really inspired by the principles of nonviolence and unarmed civilian protection, de-escalation, those types of things. We have a great internship program. We have internships both in the U.S. and in Europe, and in some special cases in some of our field programs. So there's ways to get involved there. Get reading, get in touch with us. We'd be happy to help folks out.